Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar. We're excited that you're here. Our topic for today is very timely. Outside looking in, how to stop the rapid rise of insider threats. Today's webinar is sponsored by Elusive Networks. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'll serve as your host and moderator. A few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, and we will be sending an email to all participants that has a link to the recording as well as the slides. We're also giving away two $50 gift cards at the end of the webinar, so please hang out, find out if you might have won one. Also, our speakers love questions, so please enter those into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar software. I'll be happy to get to those as we move into our webinar. Okay, so let's get to the topic of outside looking in, how to stop the rapid rise of insider threats. It's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. First will be Carl Mattson, who's an ex-CISO from City National Bank, and Wade Lance, Field CTO with Elusive Networks. Well, let's get things underway. I'm going to hand it off to you, Carl.
Thank you, Mitchell. I really appreciate the invitation to join today. And before we get started at talking about insider threats in the COVID area, let's go back in time a little bit to the sort of ancient days of 2019. So let's see where we were for insider threats historically. So we go one more slide to insider threats were already on the rise. So looking at the Ponemon Institute research from 2018 to 2019, they were already observing a pretty sharp increase in the number of insider-driven incidents. And like the security incidents overall, there's a period of time and a delay in detecting and identifying those incidents. In the case of insider risk incidents, Ponemon's research showed about 77 days. And the really key sort of statistic around the insider incidents is their magnitude, $11 million, the average cost of an insider incident. Those incidents are oftentimes fewer, but more expensive. So as we look at the insider threat trajectory now, we want to look at the factors that will drive things in the COVID era. So motivation. So the first thing to think about in motivation is the psychology of an employee. The Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute research on insider threat shows that about 92% of malicious insider events were precipitated by a negative event at work. Negative events at work are in abundance right now. People are experiencing layoffs or reductions in hours, and that creates financial pressure on individuals. It creates distractions for people. So not to say that a layoff or a termination necessarily turns a good person into a bad person, but somebody who may already be predisposed to commit a crime and to do something harmful or negligent at their employer now has that extra incentive. So while early returns on attempts are fairly limited, I think one can sort of project fairly obviously that there are motivators and there are stressors in the workplace environment that will cause the number of attempts to increase. And then the second feature here, of course, is the opportunity. Whether it's real or whether it's perceived, the work from home environment does create a scenario in which the employee may believe that they have the lack of oversight. That would include things like storing sensitive materials at home, local printing, just the everyday sort of lack of peers around you who might sort of see what you're doing and observe your behavior as unusual compared to normal. So when we look at the number of attempts in insider risks, that includes both those that are intentional, those that are unintentional or negligent. There's the writing is on the wall. The motivation for those attempts, as well as the opportunity for an event for an employee to either commit negligently or on purpose an event, those factors are definitely on the increase. So meanwhile, as a security team, we have a couple of things working against us. Number one, our own teams have stress and fatigue. The security team itself, on a personal level and an organizational level, feels those stressors. As well, we're seeing spike in different attacks like phishing and malware. So we're seeing alerts increase Meanwhile, our baseline of normal behavior is starting to wear away. So when employees maybe commonly work on at certain times of day, Monday through Friday, we're starting to see that baseline behavior normalize throughout the nights and weekends. We're starting to see anomalies harder and harder to detect because the behavior pattern of the organization is changing. And so if you put those two things together, you sort of have a perfect storm of insider risk. So first thing we want to look at is 2008. What happened during the last financial crisis? We saw a 75% increase in the number of insider attacks. I think you would definitely look at the motivation there. In 2018, 2019, there's this recent uptick in insider events. We get to where we are today in the COVID, unemployment spiking. I think anyone's guess as to where that will bottom out, but we are already at 30 million unemployment claims as of this economic cycle. And what this creates is a situation where we have all these alerts coming in, and the cyber activity is rising, and the yield is this gap. And the gap is a function both of the increased stressors that will create motivations for insiders to do things that are undesirable, as well as the lower probability that security teams will be able to identify that signal out of the noise. So like I said, Ponemon type research that's comprehensive is oftentimes takes a great deal of time to put together. But I think as security professionals, our awareness of the motivators here and our awareness of this increased risk base is really essential right now, because the gaps are really obvious. So the other technologies that of course we leverage for insider threat defense and detection, access and identity. Obviously, there are SIM systems, UBA, UEBA. So I want to focus on UBA for a second, because insider threat, of course, is definitely a focus of a UBA platform, and those platforms can be very effective, but they are also very sophisticated. They take a lot of time and money over time to develop the algorithms to detect user behavior. And like we talked about just a moment ago, as baseline behavior begins to change rapidly, have we lost the ability to separate that signal from the noise? CASB, I think, is another really important feature, because if you're in an organization that now has a remote workforce, most organizations have found themselves in the position of making security compromises, and security compromises for the benefit of the users who now, overnight started working from home. So perhaps we're allowing access to direct access to cloud applications, or perhaps we're allowing business units to procure new SaaS offerings. And so CASB controls can absolutely be effective, but when we have this sort of surge in remote demand and surge or changes in the environment, CASB may not catch everything, as well as DLP. I mean, DLP technologies, I think most security professionals would suggest are difficult. They're difficult to deploy, they're difficult to maintain, and that's not unique to any one product, but they require a great deal of administrative and care and feeding to make them effective. So when we look across the space of control technologies that we have, it takes sort of a degree of sophisticated and perfect ability for us as security professionals to get all of these things to orchestrate our technologies really, really well in order to detect a sophisticated or an insider event. And that creates a condition where we as security professionals, if we're relying on these technologies, we have almost no room for error. And that's problematic for us to sleep at night, is to know that we may be dependent on a single control or a single technology to prevent that incident from happening. So the key concepts we want to talk further about today, first, of course, is eliminating surface risks, and that's providing insiders the easy opportunity for access. So in reducing opportunity, of course, if we're leaving keys to the kingdom just laying around everywhere and making it easy for someone to create a theft of data or damage, that's something we first want to pick off the low-hanging fruit. The next thing that we want to focus on is looking at separating the signal from the noise, because our telemetry today, whether it's our SIM or our UBA system or other systems that we're using for behavioral detection, those behaviors are changing. So in addition to the technologies that everybody's going to have a SIM, what is a deterministic way that we can detect threats so that we have a very positive, in our favor, signal to noise ratio? And then the last thing is about the layered protection and defense. And as a security professional, we commonly get in our soapbox and talk about layers of defense and defense in depth. And by and large, it's an extremely important concept. But multiple detection points. So if it's only our CASB, or if it's only our UBA, or it's only our DLP solution that's standing in the way of us suffering that $10 million loss event, then as security teams, we're at risk. So we want to think about this problem from a behavioral and a deterministic, and layers of controls that might be able to identify insider risk behavior. So that's where I'm going to turn it over to Wade Lands from Elusive, and Wade is going to talk through some techniques today. So Wade, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Carl. Certainly appreciate that insight. And I want to take a little time and just kind of discuss the Elusive approach to wrestling this very difficult issue, particularly in this difficult season. How to deal, insiders have a real advantage. External threats, they get a beachhead, they have to do a lot of discovery, versus the insider knows a lot about, in many cases, our security and where the crown jewel data is. And so at Elusive, we're really focused on how to shift the balance of power back over to the security team, even when they're wrestling with a malicious insider. So kind of taking a look at the malicious insider, I think one thing to remember, and this is brought up a little earlier, it's not always someone who's a professional criminal. In a lot of cases, we've got people that are working hard and under a lot of pressure, either economic or personal, and then maybe things don't go their way, and in a snap decision can be tempted into behavior that could be costly for the organization. So in this case, we've got scientist Steve here. He's just a few months into a 30-year mortgage. COVID comes out of the middle of nowhere. Maybe he doesn't feel like his company's really addressing his issues. He's in a conversation with a colleague who's at a competitor, and it represents perhaps an issue that he hasn't been faced with before. And again, he's working from home. He doesn't feel the oversight that he typically has if he was in the office. It's kind of a temptation moment. On the other side of the equation, we have the incident response team, the security team. Joe's stressed too, right? He's also trying to work from home. He's not sitting amongst his peers so much. There's no big SOC layout with all the different tools that he's typically used to. The number of alerts are coming fast and furious. We're seeing as much as a 300% growth in alert rates because user behavior has changed so dramatically. And so at the same time where an insider, a person that might not normally be an insider, in fact, is moving that direction and tempted that way, our incident response and monitoring capabilities are also struggling. So we're going to do a real simple scenario today and just kind of walk through what some of this might look like from both the insider threat perspective and then also exactly what we can do about it. So here's an example of how Steve might make his move. And so from his system, if he looks onto that host, he may identify a credential on that system where, let's say, an external administrator has connected to that system and a credential has been left behind in memory or someplace. And so perhaps he's able to run a simple tool like Windows Credential Editor or a Mimikatz or just a basic tool that's allowed to look into the memory. And he, in fact, is able to identify this domain admin one user and the credential that is in memory on his system. And this represents a very high level of temptation now because he doesn't have to worry so much about someone walking behind him at the office and looking at his screen. And he, in fact, has identified a highly privileged credential, which then he's in a position to use on a file share. So again, looking at his system, he's noticing a couple of map network drives. Some of this information he wouldn't normally have access to, or he might have partial access to these drives, but not all the data. But now that he has this privileged credential, he's in a position to connect to one of these drives and to examine these drives, in this case, for trial results, patent information, highly sensitive information, now available, the combination of the network share and also the privileged credential. So unfortunately, Steve, kind of makes his move and he grabs a document. He's able to open the directory and see sensitive data that he normally wouldn't have access to. And in fact, some of it, that release plan or the raw data or the findings, something looks interesting, and he, in fact, pulls the document down onto his system. And it's very easy to do, right? Curiosity, at Elusive, we have identified vast numbers of inside threats for our customers, and it's interesting, almost every time the initial defense that the insider brings up is, I was just curious and just looking around, right? I didn't realize I had access to that thing, and I went there and I was just curious. And unfortunately, maybe that started as a curiosity, but in many cases it ends up as a malicious and in fact a criminal act. And so let's look at what options we can give the security team. And the first option that we can give the security team from Elusive is a way to manage the attack surface, a way to look across the computers and systems in the environment and identify this low-hanging fruit, these privileged credentials, connection strings to sensitive hosts, identify that information, and in fact clean it. We call this attack surface management, looking at the kind of objects that insiders and other threat actors leverage. And there's an opportunity here to even backplant deceptive credentials into this place. So the first step is a cleaning, and a second step is a backplanting of deceptive data. So this is kind of what that looks like on a particular endpoint. You can see here on this is example, we've run Minicats on a particular system. And there's two different users here. And notice with Minicats, we see both the username, the domain, and the password in clear text. It's able to brute force that data. We notice that this help desk user is in fact a privileged user, and this credential sits in memory and now can be leveraged on this system. So the first step in the process is where Elusive would, as it goes through its process of examining the data on the systems, through policy, it would automatically remove sensitive data off of the system so that this low-hanging fruit and very tempting object is not available to the insider. Simply remove that credential so that that's not available to them. The next step in the process is really a powerful capability, is to backplant onto the system, in place of that credential, a very believable deceptive credential that will allow us to still provide someone what appears to be a juicy opportunity to move laterally and get access to sensitive things, but in fact, it's a deceptive object, and if they use it, they will be detected. And that's kind of some of the secret sauce of Elusive and kind of how we operate. We do our deceptive work on the production system itself, and the real trick with this is to do this continuously and at scale throughout the entire enterprise, and it has to be customized and targeted for every single system. The deceptive data that we plant, the credentials in this place, have to be completely believable in order to lure someone into using this data. So in this case, what happened to Steve is, rather than actually get the domain user 1 credential, what he actually gets is a deceptive credential called domain user 2. And the moment that he used that credential, we detect on that behavior and respond to that action. But let's play this story a little bit further, because there's lots and lots of layers of prevention and detection built into the system. Note here that with this domain admin 2, we're now detecting this behavior, but he goes to a file share. Now, this is the same access last time, but now, in fact, there is the opportunity to have deceptive file shares on this system. And so that, again, in real mode, it appears as if Steve has a couple of options here for network drives that he could access in a normal situation. However, after the elusive planting of deceptive data, there are now a series of options for him to pick from, and the insider has to, first of all, do something kind of out of the normal, go down to the command prompt and start searching for hidden shares and this kind of thing, and then actually attempt to connect to these. And so, you know, without elusive, the low-hanging fruit is always available to an attacker. With elusive, you know, kind of those easy pickings are gone, and now the attacker, the insider, is faced with a decision to make where the majority of the data that they're facing is deceptive, and if they use it, they'll be detected. So what that looks like kind of as a visualization is, you know, this image we've got up, don't you love the purple? This image that we've got up here represents a visualization that we actually have in the elusive interface, a little bit different than this, but it's the same idea, where we're looking at the actual data that lives on the computers themselves, what credentials are available, what connection strings are available. If I'm an attacker and I land on one of your systems, or more importantly, if I'm an insider and you gave me this system to use, right? With insiders, we give them the beachhead into our environment. What's available to them on this system? What will they be able to see? And so what elusive does is continuously examines the environment, looking for these risky conditions, either sensitive credentials or privileged connection strings to crown jewel assets, continuously identifying misconfigurations and auditing for PAM solutions or identity and access management solutions that have missed particular accounts or leftovers, and then going through a process of simply removing those objects off the production environment, simply denying the attacker those kinds of opportunities. Then what's really interesting is that we then take the data that we discovered by looking at the production systems and customize a crafted story. It's a living, breathing, dynamic story about what the environment would look like if there were more servers, more workstations, more users with more applications and more interactions that are all absolutely targeted to the organization and to the individual systems themselves. And so now, when an insider looks at this environment and begins to see where they can go, there's lots of options. There's lots of places to go. There's lots of credentials to be leveraged, and they're all very realistic and targeted for the environment. The difficulty is that the vast majority of them are deceptive in nature, and this is really a game changer for us. The storytelling is so realistic that even the insider is tricked into using these all the time. And it really gives the security team, it kind of takes the pressure off of the security team and puts it onto the insider or the attacker, rather than us kind of trying to dig through the logs and figure out if this behavior is normal or malicious. We're now pushing that pain over to the attacker or the insider, and they're having to figure out, are these credentials and connection strings real or are they deceptive? And then we, as the security team monitoring the environment, have this clear view of what's deceptive data and what's normal data, so it doesn't impede our administrative or security processes in any way. It doesn't interfere with the user unless they violate policy and start searching through the environment, right? It's not normal user behavior to bash your way on your workstation into another user's profile and pull their credentials out, or say, run Minicats and scrape a credential out of memory. That's not normal user behavior. So it really puts a tall order in front of the attacker. So let's keep playing this through and kind of seeing how Joe's really taken Steve to task here. In this process, what Steve has attempted to do now that he's interacting with this deceptive file share is to pull down an individual file. And what he sees in a traditional environment is he would be looking at file shares, and everything that he sees is real. But with an elusive deceptive environment, there's more data, and most of that data has been manipulated based on him using a malicious method. And so once again, Steve is in a really difficult spot. Again, he's got to be perfect in deciding what's real versus what's deceptive. as he goes to make a selection about pulling a file off of this share. But he does make his selection and he pulls it down off of the system. And in this case, what he's got is a beaconized file. That file, when it's open, not only did we see on Elusive him pull it off of the Deceptive file share, but then when he opens it on his system, the file beacons out to Elusive and says, okay, I was downloaded from over here, and here's where I'm waking up, and here's where I'm operating. And so really what we've done is put a layered defense into the environment, starting on the production systems themselves, with both credentials and connection strings, then moving on to the network devices, then moving on to the files levels themselves. And so it really just makes an environment completely hostile to the insider. In fact, kind of serving up what it looks like what they might be after, but in fact, at every turn, they've got to be perfect. And if they make a mistake, we catch them. And of course we do. In production environments, we detect this behavior all the time. And it's really, really a game changer for the security teams. You know, we talk about in many cases the cyber asymmetry, this advantage that the attacker has in so many cases. If an attacker is successful in getting a beachhead in the environment, and of course with an insider, we gave them the beachhead. Once they're in that position, it's very, very difficult to differentiate their behavior from normal. And everything that they see in our environment is real and an opportunity for them to leverage and learn. But with Elusive, we really shifted that dynamic. Rather than the security team having to be perfect every time, now the insider has to be perfect every time. Every decision that they make along the path has to somehow magically avoid deceptive information at every turn. And so part of what happens in this process is that if at any point they leverage deceptive information, Elusive gathers forensics information from the source system that they're operating off of silently as it's happening. So we can see here a full forensics timeline where the operator has not just leveraged Elusive deceptive data, but also every other thing that's happening on their system. Up to and including the desktop screenshots off of the user's system as the insider is pulling information off of the environment. And this is really powerful. One of our customers had a situation where an employee accessed a deceptive file share and pulled some data down. And the next day, that person's manager and a security person came to their office and said to the employee, hey, yesterday I noticed you reached out and touched this particular server, and I'm just curious what that was about. And the guy said, well, I was in network neighborhood and just clicking trying to get to one of my file shares, and I clicked on the wrong system, and I was clicking so fast I opened a directory and realized that wasn't the share, the system I was looking for, and so I backed out and went back over to the place I had expected to go to. At which point the security analyst turned the laptop around to show them the Elusive interface and said, actually, here's a complete list of all of your behavior and the screenshots to support it. You were not in network neighborhood when you accessed that system. You had a command prompt up, and the first thing that you did here, you can see this is where you ran net view in order to expose the hidden shares that were on your system. The next thing that you did here is a screenshot of you running net use in order to connect to that system. Here's where you downloaded a file off of that system called executivecompensation.xlsx. Here's a screenshot of you embedding that spreadsheet into a PowerPoint presentation and then deleting the file. Here's a screenshot of you saving that PowerPoint presentation as a PDF file with a completely innocuous name. And here's a screenshot of you sending that PDF to a non-company email address. So you're fired, and you'll be contacted by our attorneys. And so this is a real game changer for the security teams, to really have this ability to immediately identify, not in a probabilistic way, but in a deterministic way, when someone is violating company policy and operating in a malicious manner, and presenting the information both visually and in a clean chronological way, so it makes it very clear to understand what the user was doing and what the process was. So stopping insider threats, getting into action, kind of as a summary, what we wanted to do today was talk about both kind of the difficulties in the space, and I think Carl did a great job discussing that, and then also talk about actions that we can take to really shift the dynamic for the security team to have leverage over the inside threat. And so the first part of the action, the first essential element in this process is, blocking and tackling, right? What a surprise for security teams. The first thing is good cyber hygiene. Get a capability to audit the systems themselves and determine what information is actually available. We at Elusive, built this attack surface manager capability and took it out to the space. It's our customers are just absolutely excited and elated about this capability because it really gives them visibility into a kind of a vulnerable state in their environment that's really, really hard today to get visibility into without Elusive. One customer put it this way, he said, we build policy in Active Directory, right? We have GPOs about how credentials are supposed to be used. We build policy in privileged account management systems. I think they were using CyberArk and LAPS in order to manage, domain credentials and local administrator credentials. And we have policy about which systems at a network level are allowed to talk to other systems. We have all these policies. He said, but before Elusive's attack surface manager, what we didn't have was a way to continuously audit our production workstations and servers and continuously look for where those policies were not having the effect that we intended. We're setting policy, but we really weren't able to audit it and see the actual results of those policies, and that's what Elusive Attack Surface Management provides. Furthermore, unlike a vulnerability scan that just comes back and says, okay, here's the vulnerable services and applications and operating systems that are in your environment. Furthermore, Elusive Attack Surface Management doesn't just identify these conditions, it also provides a powerful tool for the security team to automatically remediate and clean those conditions, which is a huge force multiplier for the security team. And one customer had just about 20,000 systems in their environment. And we did a scan and noticed that with Attack Surface Manager and noticed that over 1,500 systems had multiple local administrator accounts that had existed for over 4 years. And in many cases, the passwords were the same and had not changed in over 4 years. There were administrative accounts that were being managed by LAPS, but there were the other local administrator accounts that were being used, weren't being managed, shared passwords and usernames, and the passwords hadn't changed in years in many cases. And of course, the security team's eyes got this big around. They didn't realize that this condition was present in their environment, and it's a huge opportunity for an attacker. A local administrator account can do anything they want on that system. And so I saw the guy's face kind of melt in the security team, and I said, hey, what's the problem? He goes, do you realize how much work it is going to be for us to go around and try to build a script and go through a process to try to clean this on 1,500 some odd systems? I mean, this is a Herculean task. And I said, actually, it's not. We'll just set a policy in Attack Surface Manager to have the system go out and clean those events. 15 minutes, all of those conditions were remediated off of all of those systems. This is a real game changer for security teams. And any security team, no matter where they're at in the cyber maturity process, can leverage this kind of cyber hygiene to really change their security posture in a very meaningful way. The next step in changing the dynamic against an insider is to plant deceptive data to, in effect, give the attacker what they're looking for. And what this does is, no matter how well we clean the environment, there's always leftovers. There's, systems have to do business. People have their jobs to do. There's always going to be opportunities in the space. And so really, without Elusive planning this deceptive data throughout the environment, everything the attacker sees is real. Every opportunity that they find, in fact, is an opportunity. But with Elusive, when we backplant this deceptive data, it completely changes the game, where now an attacker can't be confident of what they're looking at, and the data that we plant is constantly maintained and managed. So, for instance, Elusive is looking at my system and it identifies that I use Chrome browser. And so what it does is plants hidden history in my Chrome browser as if I have interacted with that browser on deceptive entities. Now, when I open my browser in Chrome and I go to look at history, none of the data that Elusive has planted will appear. However, if I act like a malicious operator and I close the browser and I dump the browser database and go through it line by line, that's where I see the deceptive data. Then if I leverage that data, that's when I get a detection event. And so one of the things that the system does is that if I'm using Chrome browser today and tomorrow I start using Opera browser, the Elusive process identifies that shift in my behavior automatically and simply adapts the deceptive story to follow my behavior automatically. It's an incredibly potent capability to disrupt the inside threat's view of the environment, and to make it extremely difficult for an insider to move without creating a detection event. And then the last thing is to really get right down to the data itself as far as the target data, and to use beaconized documents and other data bits that we plant throughout the environment, so that even where someone does take information from the environment and open it elsewhere, the security team gets deeper intelligence, not just about the fact that this information was stolen, but in fact where it is being used down the line, and which user is interacting with this information, which in many cases can be a very powerful capability for the security team. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to spend some time today. It's always a pleasure to work with Carl and to talk about the inside threat and the shifts that we're facing as security teams today. So what I'd like to do, we've got a little time, is to pass it back over to Mitch and see what questions we have from the audience today.
Absolutely, we've got some really good questions teed up from the audience. First question goes to you, Carl. How frequently do insider threats occur when someone accesses an unauthorized system versus documents or information they already have on a file share or work laptop? What's your experience?
Can you repeat that one more time, Mitchell? I'm sorry.
The question was, how frequently do insider threats occur where someone accesses an unauthorized system or data versus already having sensitive documents in their file share or work laptop?
Well, I think that's going to depend greatly on the organization. But what I would suggest is pretty common is the effect of an initial deployment of a deception layer. What it's going to do right out the gate is surface behavior that users undertake on a normal basis, which is sort of against policy and bad practice. So to give you an example would be using the privileged credential or the accesses of an employee who was on your team but maybe left the company 6 months ago, but everybody in the team still uses John Smith's login to get to that system or access. And so I think the first thing would be to sort of reduce all of that sort of kind of bad behavior noise. It's not necessarily a malicious intent, but it's a lot of times like really, really sloppy administrative behavior. And there's a lot of that in most organizations where if people are sort of out of habit of using like a good practice, Honestly, even system administrators are using, usernames and passwords written on a Post-it shared on their team. And there's an avalanche of that stuff that you'll find the first time you deploy a deceptions layer. And then once you get past that sort of avalanche of noise, I think every organization is going to have a little bit of different actual sort of like intentional malicious level of signal there that I'm not sure will be common across most organizations.
Okay,
and
great.
I'd like to answer that too, if I may. One of the things that we've noticed about attacker behavior, because I think the question really raises a great point, which is there are some things that an insider has legitimate access to that they may be tempted to steal. And what we've seen very consistently is that once that shift has been made where somebody takes a choice to begin to operate as a malicious insider, they're rarely satisfied with just stealing information that they have legitimate access to. That's incredibly rare. It's like the gambler, right? If I go and I win at the blackjack table today, I'm very likely to come back and play for more. And we've seen this over and over again, where when Elusive has detected insiders because they've accessed the deceptive fabric, now the organization turns the spotlight onto all that user behavior, and we find out that in fact they have originally started by stealing information that they had legitimate access to. Had we not deployed the deceptive data, we would not have detected this user, and we would not have become aware of the fact that they're operating as an insider and continuing to siphon off information. So it becomes a powerful capability to reveal that kind of behavior, and really it just kind of addresses the human greed element that tends to be so pervasive in the process.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can imagine a lot of emotions that might be driving that kind of behavior. Next question is for you, Wade. What kind of data could be stored in the browser cookies on a desktop laptop?
That's a great point. And so browser history is such a juicy tool, right? One of the great things that Elusive does with its deceptive storytelling, unlike some other approaches in the space, Elusive doesn't just take deceptive data out of a bucket and drop it out throughout all the systems, right? All of the history that we plant, right? The URLs and the URIs and cookies and all that kind of stuff that we plant is all very targeted to how the individual system is used, right? So let's say maybe I'm working with another person, and Elusive notices there are some application servers that everybody in our unit interacts with. And so Elusive imagines additional application servers that follow the naming convention of our production application servers, and imagines additional ones. And then what it's going to do is, for those of us that interact with that application server, it's going to plant all kinds of interesting history with the imaginary deceptive application servers that now live in that space. And it's going to keep those interactions fresh and changing based on how we interact. It's so targeted that when Elusive looks at my system, it notices the application. So maybe I'm more of an application level user, so it's kind of browser based interactions with those systems, lots of web interactions and whatnot. And so that's the kind of history that I've got. Versus Carl, who's much more of a technical user, and when Elusive looks at his system, it notices that he has a series of applications that he uses. He uses Notepad++ and Putty and WinSCP and FileZilla and RDP, and Elusive says, aha, Carl's a nerd. When he interacts with these systems, he does some administrative functions. So when Elusive plants history on his system, he's going to get a good number of deceptive historical interactions, again, that are hidden on his system that point to administrative interactions with those deceptive entities. So the real difference for us is telling this compelling, believable, changing story. That's what makes the system so effective against insiders, and really draws them in, right? So there may be a policy where, back to the cookie part of the question, perhaps the user doesn't save passwords to access the production SharePoint server or application server on their system. But in the history that Elusive plants, occasionally the deceptive passwords are also included in that interaction, which makes the deceptive target much more interesting for the inside threat because they can see that there's a credential associated with that interaction.
Okay, excellent, great. Thank you from both of you. Next question is, what kind of deceptive data can be stored? And I know you gave some examples already. If you have a few others, can be stored inside servers for insiders or to be tempted by. Maybe I'll add to the question, is there any kind of deceptive data that's better to capture someone than others?
Well, that's a great question. So you can kind of do what you want to do with deceptive data. Some of the automated systems that we have use all kinds of Office objects, spreadsheets, and you know, Word documents and PDFs and that kind of stuff. It's all very, very common and very appealing. And those documents can be generated automatically using some company content and sprinkled out as is appropriate. We can also add beaconing capability to those documents. So if the documents are open, they'll call back. We can also add credential and connection data into those documents, right? Some of those documents are, you know, will have suggested changes in a network design or passwords files or whatnot that someone's storing, and the data in the files is deceptive by nature. So there's lots and lots of options about the kind of deceptive data that can be planted. What's important is that the data that's planted be relative to both the organization, how they do business, and then also the actual target, right? So that when it's being looked at, it appears to be something that would be logical in that place, and then also appealing to an insider.
And can I add to that too? There's a really rich opportunity here to use old data as deception. So an example would be old host names that are for or application servers that have been decommissioned and they've been off the network for a year. That makes for a fantastic deception because it matches the organization's naming convention, but it's no longer a system of record. The same would go for a privileged user who's no longer with the company. And keep in mind, that doesn't mean we're putting that user back in Active Directory or back in DNS. We're just putting that in a deception cap. So if you have a privileged administrator who is intending to do something malicious and they run across that server name, that host name, that session, that user, they'll recognize that as legitimate in the organization. Now it's been decommissioned. It's no longer even on the network. But that's a very effective deceptive technique, is to use what was once real information historically, but is no longer valid for any utility. That's a really convenient. That's a really effective way to deploy deception data that's nearly impossible for the individual, like a privileged user. Like for example, like a server technician who knows the environment inside and out. If that's the person, that's the type of information that's going to fool them, is to have a real server name or a real username. They see that username is being stored in cache, and they remember who John Smith was, and they assume it's real. And so, but John Smith hasn't been on the network for 6 months, and that's the type of deception that can be extremely effective for that really knowledgeable, sophisticated insider.
Excellent. Next question is, does it keep a process of custody transfer of information? So they're talking about elusive. And if yes, is it ready for legal department 1005? So what's that next step once you've identified someone's taken a step that's unauthorized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we only have chain of custody on objects for I would say 1 or 2 movements, and so that's certainly an area that we're interested in expanding. But I don't want to oversell our capability today. So I know there are other systems that have the capability to do that kind of tracing. And so for us, it's really just 1 or 2 movements. Beyond that, we kind of lose history about where it went. So between the deceptive entities and the production systems, we've got good visibility and history. After that, I don't think we have the data that we could use in a legal framework to demonstrate chain of custody beyond that level.
Okay, not a full forensic process, of course.
That's correct.
Next question, excuse me, is it practical to make a server to play the role of deceptive server whose only purpose is to be a temptation to bad actors? Kind of, I guess, a true honeypot for insider threat, if you want to think of it that way.
A true honeypot. So that's a great question. So we, at Elusive, we have full operating system, full OS decoys, full honeypots. If there's a reason to do that, that's certainly something that's possible to do. I will say that I've been personally involved in the deception industry for over 10 years. I worked for a company called Neural IQ, who had one of the first serious commercial deception platforms called Event Horizon, very interesting capability back in 2009, 2010. We did a lot of work for 3-letter agencies in the DC area. I also worked for another deception company that's still in the market today, and I've been with Elusive for a couple of years. So I've been involved in dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of deception campaigns specifically targeted against insiders. And I have to say that the honeypot is the least effective tool I've ever seen used against an insider. And the reason is that as an insider, I have typically very good knowledge about where the information is that I'm after. And the problem is I tend to not have the authority and the privileges to interact with the data. I know where I'm going, I just don't have the privileges to get there. And so honeypots, in my experience, are not an effective tool, only in very rare cases. I wouldn't say not an effective tool, but it's very rare cases that that's an effective tool because of the insider's knowledge of the environment. With the Elusive process, if as a malicious insider, I know where I'm going, I just don't have the credentials to get there in a privileged manner. Oh, look, last night, an administrator logged onto my system, or early this morning, and sloppily left their credential in memory. Now I can take that credential and do a pass the hash against that production system and an attempt to get administrative access and get the data that I want. This is such a common behavior for the insider. And of course, the deceptive data immediately triggers our detection, and we respond to that because, of course, the person has leveraged a deceptive credential, which is how we do our detections. So yes, we have full honeypots, and yes, we can use those. In the insider use cases, I generally caution people against that approach.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense, especially if they know the environment, they'll recognize it as something suspicious.
Well, and here's the thing, it takes so much work to make a honeypot be believable and realistic. It's so much work to do that. And historically, that's kind of how deception has been done. That's where you put the work. What so impressed me with Elusive and why I joined the company was that they really have shifted the paradigm and have taken the deceptive story off of the honeypot and pushed it onto the production assets. Now, as a malicious insider, I'm facing the deception story right where I'm at. It's a much more potent method, particularly for insiders who have the inside track.
Great. Next question is for you, Carl. Just to your experience as a CISO, are there any other best practices for recognizing, identifying insider threats when they occur, in addition to or the Elusive product or aspects of it?
Well, this kind of comes back to the legal question, actually. So what I'd recommend as a best practice is that the security team needs to have a partnership with legal, HR, and oftentimes a physical security, like a corporate investigative security team, and have the sequence of an insider investigation articulated as a playbook where the stakeholders understand their respective roles. So as a security organization, I'm sometimes reluctant to put on the hat of being an observer of employee behavior. That's always felt a little bit unnatural to me because I'm sort of predisposed into protecting from the external attacker. And so I'd say that the first best practice that I'd sort of highlight is that to have the partnership with legal, HR, corporate security in terms of incident handling. And that speaks actually to the question on legal that I would recommend is to have the full sequence of a scenario and the forensic trail, have that vetted in advance procedurally with those stakeholders who would be involved, because I think it'd be problematic for a security team to handle an insider threat situation in a vacuum in such a way that the security team then becomes, maybe the subject of finger pointing in terms of, did we collect the right forensics? Were our detection techniques approved? Those types of things. So I think from a practical perspective, your SOC should be doing IR exercises on an insider risk. That doesn't mean that the legal and the HR team needs to know what the deceptions look like. I mean, they don't need administrative access to the console, but procedurally, I think that should be vetted, and that's what I would suggest in terms of a best practice is an organization can do this well when it's repeatable in practice, but is unlikely to be very effective if it just pops up out of nowhere one day. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I also suggest is that another best practice is to have your penetration testing red team exercises be coordinated with the SOC team who'd be responding to an elusive alert, because what you will find is you bring in that external pen tester and their techniques on purpose are going to actually trip over these deceptions. That creates the opportunity for like a learning cycle. So it's the learning of the penetration testing team for how far can they get before they get caught, and it's a learning for the operational team in terms of detection and how complete and how effective is our deceptions layer. Because it may be, for example, that that sequence of feedback loop demonstrates that we have a gap in our detections, or perhaps our penetration testing team now knows that attack style X on the MITRE framework is not working here because we get caught every time, and they're going to go across the framework and try other attack techniques. So I'd say that this deception layer is a yin and a yang with penetration testing, and so I would suggest those types of events are really critical to getting this really done right, is to have a pen tester and a SOC analyst, event-based, working together sometimes in red team, blue team situations other times. That feedback loop would be the best practice that I could think of.
I would just make one more comment to highlight something that Carl said about the playbooks specifically designed for how is incident response and legal and all that going to handle a detection of an insider threat behavior. One of the things that we've seen is that part of those playbooks kind of need to address in advance who is the insider, what is the persona of the insider that we're dealing with now, and what access do they have, to make a determination kind of in advance based on who the attacker is and what access they have, what our response is going to be. I've seen so many cases where someone will touch something in kind of a probing manner and it'll set off an elusive detection, and the security team immediately responds to that person, hey, what are you doing, what's going on here, you shouldn't touch that, all kind of thing. And unfortunately, they didn't allow the event to play long enough to actually allow the person to demonstrate intent and prove, was this kind of a curiosity thing, or was this in fact a malicious probe? And so having made some of those determinations in advance from a security perspective and a legal perspective and a leadership perspective within the organization, so that we've decided in advance, based on the kinds of personas that we detect acting in a malicious manner, how much do we let this play and when do we respond? Deciding those things in advance can be super powerful, and having the run books, giving that clarity to the incident response team will pay big dividends down the line.
Wow, super helpful, both of your answers. We're coming up on the top of the hour. I just want to real quick throw out, there's a question about the cloud and how this applies to infrastructure in the cloud as well as in private cloud and data centers. Any thoughts on that, Wade or Carl?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. So look, cloud is another extension of what we do, and it's, of course, the current shifts in user behavior are just going to accelerate that even more. And so we're seeing big shifts into software as a service and infrastructure as a service, and that's just going to continue. And unfortunately, in many cases, that even continues to reduce visibility on the part of the security team and behavioral systems as well. So at Elusive, we've got a very proactive look into cloud capabilities, both private cloud and software as a service capabilities, and really looking at that both from a attack surface reduction. How do we monitor who's doing what, who's accessing what? And we see this all the time where software developers maybe store access keys to AWS, AWS tokens and whatnot. That's a giant problem. But not just cleaning, but then also planning deceptions that tell, again, a compelling story about those kind of environments. So cloud's a critical element, going to continue to be that way, and it's an important piece of what we do at Elusive too.
Great. Well, that kind of puts us at the top of the hour almost. I just want to get in both a thank you to both of you gentlemen for sharing your experience and expertise, telling us about the Elusive product and capabilities. Also, thank you to our audience for your questions. They were awesome. We have 2 gift cards that we're giving out today. The 2 winners are Kathy W. and Paul N. And the folks at securityboulevard.com will be reaching out to you to get a hold of those. So please check out securityboulevard.com for other exciting webinar content. And join me in thanking both Wade and Carl for being part of the webinar today. I certainly learned a lot, and it's just very interesting and fascinating in the times that we're in. So thank you, audience, for participating with us. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate that you would spend it with us. It's been my pleasure hosting the webinar today. So be safe, be well, and be careful out there.